Dan Willingham, thank you so much for having a conversation with me today. It's an absolute joy to get to talk to you. Where are you phoning in from?
I'm phoning in from the East Coast of the US, Central Virginia in particular.
Amazing. What's your favorite part about Virginia this time of the year?
I do love the topography at all times of years. It's very green. We get a decent amount of rain, but the landscape seems greener than we deserve based on what the weather we have. So it's a beautiful part of this country.
Fantastic. Before we jump into it, what's your coffee order for when I can finally nip over and buy you a coffee?
Yeah, straight black drip coffee.
Fantastic.
Very dull.
Amazing. And is there a book that you've read recently that has changed the way that you view the world? It could be within your sphere of expertise, or it could be more broadly.
Candidly, no. I get asked this every now and then, and it could be that I'm forgetting something, but I think there have been many books that have had important impacts on the way I think or on my work. But there are very few I would point to as truly transformative. The one that always comes to mind was published in the late 1980s, and I read it while I was in graduate school. It's called Learning in the Brain and written by Larry Squire. And it was just this very comprehensive overview of what was known at the time about changes in the brain subsequent to learning. And that had a big impact on me. But
Fantastic.
that, of course, was 40 years ago.
This podcast is becoming quite expensive because every time I speak to somebody, my Amazon cart fills up with a few books.
I wouldn't even recommend you. Obviously, that book's been out of print for many years.
Yeah,
And there are other books that would better serve that purpose now. So
yeah.
I'm pleased to have saved you some money.
Fantastic. What was your upbringing like, and what are you most grateful for to your family?
I think of well, I seldom think of my upbringing carefully, but I think of my upbringing as being very ordinary for my time and place. My family moved around a bit because my father kept getting more attractive job offers. So I was born in Atlanta, Georgia, lived there till I was 3. Then we moved to New York City, lived there for 4 years. Then we moved to the Bay Area, south of San Francisco, lived there for 4 years, and then to New Jersey. I was there from age 11 until I went away to college, and my parents continued to live there. So I think of myself as being from New Jersey more than anywhere else in terms of where I grew up. And each of these places, even Atlanta, which was and even New York City, we lived in the Bronx, and so we lived in pretty suburban atmospheres. So I grew up in the 60s and 70s in suburban America, and in that sense, I think my upbringing was very typical for its time and place. I attended public schools. I had the mix that most people do of wonderful teachers and a few duds and a few who I thought were duds that probably I just didn't really get along with very well and couldn't figure out how to accommodate myself to the way they taught. So yeah, I mean that was, yeah, I think a strikingly uneventful childhood.
Did you enjoy school?
Not especially. I think there were moments, but I saw school mostly as a chore to get on with. I did not, look forward to going to school, and I did look forward to vacations, which I think is a fair barometer of a child's attitude towards school.
It's really interesting, and I love hearing about people's stories and experiences in school because they're so varied. And I have the privilege of speaking to some truly inspirational educators and thinkers like yourself. And the experience of kids at school is vastly different. And did you think that you would, looking back, I've heard that things make sense or the dots seem to connect looking backwards, not so much looking forwards. Did you see yourself as being in academia and as a writer? Does it seem like a natural progression when you look backwards, or are you shocked at where your career has led you?
There are a bit of both, I think. Certainly when we talk about being a young child or being a teenager, I certainly didn't know what I was going to do. I gave very little thought to it. Both of my parents were psychologists, and to me meant my father was a psychometrician and worked for the college board and for educational testing service in various capacities. And for those who are not in the US, those are the educational testing service is big corporation that
Yeah.
creates standardized tests. My mother was met my father in a experimental psychology course
Wow.
in graduate school that was being taught by my uncle, being taught by my
Wow.
mother's. So psychology ran deep in my family, and that to me that meant I wanted no part of psychology. And
Okay.
so I thought I landed on an English major actually because I was interested in writing. But then in the spring of my sophomore year, I took introduction to psychology just because I sort of thought I should. And I was a goner after that, and I added psychology as a major, and that soon, in no small part, because all of my worst grades in college were in my major in my English
Wow.
courses.
Interesting.
Yeah, I enjoyed it, but I was not very good at it and really didn't understand a whole lot. But I enjoyed it, and so so that was how I came to be an experimental psychologist. But then, in terms of writing about education, I had no interest in education at all and trained at the sort of intersection of neuroscience and experimental psychology. Did that for about 15 years, the first 15 years of my career, and then got interested in education completely by accident because I was invited to a conference to address a bunch of teachers to talk to them about cognitive psychology. I was invited by the president of a nonprofit, the founder of a nonprofit here in town in Charlottesville, where I live. And this was a national organization, and they had a yearly conference. And so he said, "How'd you like to come and say something about cognitive psychology to 500 teachers?" And I said, "I really don't know anything about classrooms. I wouldn't have anything interesting to say." He said, "No, we get that. We just think it would be interesting for the teachers to hear about cognitive psychology." So I rashly said, "Okay." And then 6 months later, I realized, oh my gosh, I have to give this talk in a couple of weeks, and realized I didn't know what in the world I was going to
Mm.
tell a bunch of teachers about learning that they didn't already know. And so my strategy was to just go through. By that time, I'd been teaching, I started teaching Introduction to Cognitive Psychology in graduate school, and I had
Yeah,
taught
wow.
it every year. So I had that course very well under control. And so I just went through my materials and picked out an hour's worth of phenomena and demonstrations and stuff that I thought teachers might find relevant. But I was very, very anxious about giving this talk and really thought it was going to be insulting, a disaster. And instead, it turned out to be the opposite. The teachers who were there thought, first of all, they didn't know all this stuff as I had
Wow.
thought they would. And
Interesting.
second, they thought it was quite relevant to their work. And in the audience was the editor of American Educator, which
Yeah.
is a magazine published quarterly by one of the big teachers unions here in the States. And she said, maybe you should do some writing for us. And I said, God, maybe I should, because I was so startled by the extent to which my
Wow.
field had done just a terrible job of communicating what we know about how people. That talk really changed my career.
Interesting.
Over the next 5 years or so, I increasingly started doing more and more translation and writing for educators and less basic research. And then in 2007, I just sort of completely shifted 100%.
Gosh, so many questions, Dan, and we don't have time to unpack all of that. But I think it's really fascinating, that journey, because I'm interested in people that are not necessarily involved in the profession but looking in. And you mentioned when you began speaking at this conference, you were, I'm paraphrasing here, but really an outsider looking into a profession.
Uh-huh.
What were some of the things that you talked about that you were surprised really resonated with teachers? What were some of those things that you
Yeah,
remember?
so keep in mind, Matt, I'm presenting content that if you come to the University of Virginia and sort of wonder about how people think, my
Hmm.
course is the first thing you'll take.
Yeah,
Like
yeah,
you'll come to my course knowing nothing.
yeah,
And this was the kind of stuff that I was talking about. So things like, very basic principles of if people are thinking this way during an experience, they're very likely to remember the experience. If
yeah.
they're thinking that way, they're very unlikely to remember it. Simple demonstrations of the importance of attention to learning and memory. So yeah, those were the kinds of things that
Wow.
were in that.
It's really interesting. And you've obviously published extensively, and we don't have time to unpack all of your work. But one of the books that keeps coming up again and again in this interview is your work, Why Students Don't Like School. So, cognitive
Mhm.
scientists answer the questions about how the mind works and what it means for the classroom. Sorry, I'm aware that I've just paraphrased your book title back to you, which is a little bit awkward.
And actually, you did paraphrase because the title is not Why Students Don't Like School. The title is Why Don't Students Like School? So the first is declarative. The second, which is the
Yeah,
actual
interesting.
title, is a question. And that was quite conscious
That's really
on
interesting.
my part. Yeah.
That's really interesting. So, why don't students like school? I know that's a huge question, but what are
Yeah.
some of the reasons why you think there are so many students that school isn't a place that they feel is for them?
So the first thing I'll mention is that the title of the book is a little bit of a publisher's stunt, and I take some responsibility
Yeah, yeah,
for it
you need to
also.
sell
But
books. I
it's
understand.
a
Yeah.
yeah, right. I need to own up to this, but the because I do get heat from people sometimes saying like the book doesn't really answer the question, and it doesn't. But the conceit in that book is that each chapter is titled with a question that I thought teachers would find interesting. And the reason it's a question is and the funny thing is when the publisher first said we want to take the title of the first chapter and make that the title of the book. Why don't students like school? And I was like, it's not like people are going to think the book is about something else. And they said, well, yeah, but the subtitle helps. And I'm like, people don't read subtitles anyway. We had a lot of back and forth. And their eventual concession to me was that they made the don't is in italics.
Yeah.
Virtually no one notices that or pays attention to it. But the point is, like, if learning is natural and you think people are naturally curious, like everyone should love school,
Yeah.
but not everybody loves school. So there are lots of reasons people like school or don't like school. I mean, my wife is fond of pointing out she is a teacher and loves school. Didn't really, I mean, didn't love the academic part of it as a kid so much. She loved school for its social element. So, correspondingly, there are lots of reasons people don't like school. In that chapter, I was trying to get at this question, this particular aspect of the question. If learning is natural, if people are naturally curious, why isn't the case that everybody, every child loves school? And so it's really an excuse to explore curiosity, talk about what is it that makes us curious, makes us want to engage. And in the book, I emphasize one aspect of curiosity, which
Mm.
is that it's heavily dependent on what you already know.
Yeah.
And this is easy to appreciate if you think about the extremes of knowledge. So if I said to you, I happen to know how many cans of hard cider are sold in Australia every year. Would you like to know that? Like,
Yes,
would that trigger curiosity?
I think so.
And again, if you think about the extremes, like on the one hand, you maybe already know the answer to that, in which case it clearly won't trigger
Yeah.
curiosity. On the other hand, if you know, as I know, nothing about the beverage industry or the hard cider industry or anything that's related
Yeah.
to it, if I tell you, you're not curious because if I tell you, you have nothing to connect it to. It's this
Yeah.
isolated factoid. And so a lot of times people describe curiosity as, well, it's natural that we're curious. We see animals, many animals are curious. It's adaptive to know about your world. But there's a little more to it than that because we're not just collectors of facts. If all we were collectors of facts, then when I say, do you want to know how many hard, you would be like, yeah, another fact. Lay it on me about the hard cider. We're interested in understanding our world.
Mm.
And understanding requires coordinating new information with information that you already have. So
That's
that's the
amazing.
long version of why the book is titled the way it is.
That's great, and I love. I mean, there's so many aspects of the book, but one of the things I mean, I'm the proud dad of two young daughters. They may or may not come out and interrupt this conversation. I've got a 5-year-old and a 7-year-old, and they are naturally curious. I've spent a huge amount of my career in kindergarten classrooms, and it is magic when you hear some of the questions that these young people ask. But it's really quite upsetting to see that as we progress through school, quite often we stop asking those questions, don't we? We stop being curious and we stop having that sense of awe and wonder. How do you think teachers do a better job of making sure that that curiosity is built throughout their schooling and not just in those early years?
So I mean, it's worth there. I think there are a couple of reasons that curiosity declines as children get older. First of all, I'll say this is something that people have tried to explore
Mm.
empirically. I'm not just tried, people have explored empirically, and there's not a clear answer. So this is all pretty speculative, and these are some of the various theories. And there doesn't have to be one reason, right? There
Yeah.
can be
Yeah.
multiple contributors. So one clear reason is if part of your curiosity is trying to better understand your world, well, when you're very young, you understand damn near nothing. And
That's
so
right.
you're curious because, like, gosh, really got to figure stuff out here. And you're constantly being confronted with things that it would be useful for you to know more about. The other thing is that when you're young and you're in school, anything that you're curious about, your teacher is very likely to respond positively
Mhm.
and provide you with some information and so on. As you start to move, especially sort of into the middle elementary grades, you're 9, you're 10, there's a curriculum and it's kind of like, we're kind of doing this now. And
Mhm.
so saying, when you're first learning how to read, if you say to a teacher, like, I'm not real, this book about plants is boring. I don't want to read this. I'm
Yeah.
curious about this other thing. That's great. That doesn't really fly as children get older. This is another thing that the third point is something that I brought up in that first chapter of Why No Students Like School. If curiosity depends on understanding, and understanding depends on what you already know about the subject matter or the domain. Teachers have a really, really hard job because children come into their classroom knowing different things. And so, you're seldom teaching, if you're a teacher,
True.
cans of cider, but maybe you are teaching about plants.
Yeah.
And some kids already know a little bit, and some kids know absolutely nothing, right? And so finding that sort of sweet spot of uh, uh, knowledge assumed in children is pretty much impossible because you've
Yeah.
got 25 kids who know different things. That said, what I end up saying later in the book and have elaborated on elsewhere is I think the best way to try to trigger curiosity is to make sure that children understand the question that is at stake. So in a brief podcast like this is the metaphor that I think will give you the idea of what I'm talking about. When you think about a lesson plan, the lesson plan is really an answer to a question. The question is usually not in the lesson plan, and the students almost certainly do not know what the question is. And so spending perhaps 10 or 15% of a lesson elaborating on the question, getting buy-in on the
Yeah.
question, showing students why the question is important, I think that's the best bet for triggering curiosity.
Dan, in your own experience, as I've just turned 40, or beginning of this year, I turned 40, and I want to maintain that curiosity and that wonder because I think life is a wonderful experience. Do you have any thoughts on how we do that as adults? How do you keep your sense of awe and wonder at the world around you? Because even just hearing you talking about awe and wonder, you're lighting up and getting really passionate and really excited. How do you
Yeah.
keep that? Because I think most people, as they get older, tend to lose that. Would you agree?
I don't know if I agree or not. I certainly think
Is it a skill that
it's
you have?
it's a worthy goal. I'll offer one basic suggestion, which is, and I did write about this. I do have a piece on curiosity where I talk about trying to make yourself feel curious, and it feels a little bit like trying to make yourself laugh. It's sort of like if there's something out there that's funny, then I laugh, and similarly, I can't make myself be curious. And I don't think that's wrong, but so I think the approach is trying to put yourself into situations where curiosity is more likely.
Right.
So if, for example, you spend a lot of time on social media, like, sort of watch yourself. Like if your goal is to feel curiosity, awe, wonder, how often do you feel that when you're, on Snapchat or Instagram or whichever social media of choice is yours? I would say that's not something I get out of social media. I do get other things, but I don't get curiosity and awe and wonder. And so try and put yourself into situations, spend your time on things so that you are more likely to engage in that learning. So bookmark, long read, long format fiction or nonfiction. That you've enjoyed in the past, websites that feature that kind of content.
Interesting.
Even things like taking a different route to, this is
Yeah.
another example I gave. Across the street from my office is a cemetery, and it wasn't until I had been at UVA about 10 years that I discovered that buried in that cemetery is the third best-selling author in the US during the 19th century.
Right.
This author sold more books than anyone else, and what he was behind was Webster's Dictionary and the Bible.
Wow.
And his name is McGuffey, and the McGuffey readers were widely used in schools. It was a multi-volume set, and he was a professor at the University of Virginia. Now, I discovered that because I was on my way to from the Department of Psychology to the School of Education, and I decided to just take a different route, and I went through the cemetery. And so you don't discover interesting, awe-inspiring, wonderful things every time you do that. But it's like fishing. Like you're not going to catch anything if your line's
Yeah.
not in the water. And so
Yeah.
you need to be patient, but do lots of little things that maybe provide opportunities for curiosity.
Yeah, I think that's wonderful. I mean, there's something about slowing down. I recently had the privilege of interviewing Oliver Burkeman. I'm not sure if you're familiar with his work. He wrote a book called 4,000 Weeks, and it sounds incredibly sad and depressing, but he talks about we are roughly alive if we live to 80 to 4,000 weeks. Being someone who has just approached his 2000th week, it made me sort of pause and think. And he talks a lot about this, about finding awe and wonder in the everyday and essentially just slowing down and taking it in. And one of the things that I've started to do is go for a walk each day and take a photo of something which is just memorable, something which I would usually just walk past. It could be a flower, it could be a beautiful wall. That sounds a bit random, but just slowing down and sort of finding awe and wonder in beauty and the things that I would miss usually in my everyday. I'm interested, Dan, is there a skill that you're currently trying to refine? For example, are you learning an instrument? Are you refining a new skill? Are you developing a hobby? Is there some way that you are kind of cultivating that awe and wonder and also that notion of beginning again in a particular area of your life?
It's really only been in the last year or two that I've started to feel like I sometimes have moments where I'm not quite sure what to do with myself. And, something like a hobby or
Yeah.
something new would have some space.
I was just having a conversation with my wife, and as I mentioned, we've got quite young children, and we feel like for the first time in 7 years or so, we're just able to breathe slightly because it's at the moment it's Saturday sport and running kids around to birthday parties and all of this wonderful thing. But to actually, we feel recently that we can just sort of stop and take a breath because it is
Mhm.
quite complex. I'm sure you can relate with twice the number of children that I have, but yeah, that's particularly you must be incredibly organized to have four children. Dan, to change direction slightly, what advice would you give for teachers that are trying to create learning environments where students thrive? I mean, you talked a little bit about the importance of asking kind of guiding questions. Is there anything else that you would like to add for the teachers that are listening to be able to make just really incredible learning environments for their students?
Yeah, it's hard to boil it down to I don't have very brief go-tos of
Hmm.
that sort. I'll offer a couple of sort of meta observations. The first is concerns the role of science in teaching. I think that understanding something about what scientists know about how children learn, what motivates them, what their emotional lives are like, I do think that can be really useful for teachers. One thing that we know is that teachers already have beliefs
Hmm.
before they ever begin their, a teacher education program. They already have beliefs about how children learn, what their emotional lives are like, and so on. And though inevitably those beliefs are going to influence your practice. So I can, in your teacher education program, you'll be told, here's a good strategy when you want the entire class's attention. Here's a good, you're told all these sort of moves. But so much of what happens in a classroom, no one's ever told you what to do. And so in those moments, you're
That's true.
winging it.
Yeah,
And
that's
you're
true.
inevitably going to be guided in part by your beliefs about children's attention or
Yeah.
memory or whatever it is. And so I think that science can offer useful information to help modify your model of what of how children learn.
Mhm.
That said, I don't think science should really ever be prescriptive about what teachers do. The
Mhm.
closest we may become is we can get pretty prescriptive on a small number of items about what needs to end up in a child's head, but not necessarily what a teacher does. So it's very difficult for most children to learn to read in the absence of knowledge of letter sound correspondences
Yeah.
for readers of English. That doesn't mean science shows you have to use this phonics program or really any phonics program. But the truth is, like, if children are going to end up with that knowledge in their head, what's your plan if you
Mhm.
don't want to use some sort of program that teaches that phonics information systematically? So when I think about advice for teachers, that's what I think about. I think that they're the type of science that I'm trying to bring to the profession offers lots of tools, and it doesn't really prescribe practice in any important way. I'll
Yeah.
leave it there.
What are your thoughts on learning styles? Because in Australia there is there's been an interesting dialogue for a number of years about learning styles. What are your thoughts? Firstly, what are they for those that are not aware? And what are your
Yeah.
thoughts on using them in the classroom?
Learning styles are absolutely fascinating to me. So, learning styles is the idea that different people have different ways in which they optimally either perceive the world accurately
Interesting.
or learn new things. And so there are lots of varieties of these styles. So probably the best known is visual, auditory, and kinesthetic, that you can, when you're trying to get a child to learn something new, you can either present it visually. So if it's addition, you might have some
Yeah.
stickers and you're showing them groups of stickers. If it's auditory, if it's an auditory learner, you might try and present addition information in
Yeah.
rhythms. If it's kinesthetic, moving your body, you might have them play with beads or something. So the important thing is that this is distinct from the idea of ability. Learning styles are not the idea that people vary in their abilities. Like some people have a better visual memory than others.
Mm.
That's not controversial. That's absolutely true. But this is a different idea. Ability is supposed to be, I mean, if a style and ability were the same thing, you would just call it ability.
Yeah.
Style is supposed to be, this is where I think an analogy to sports is actually useful. You can have two players on a basketball team who are equivalent in ability, but play with a different style. One has a very aggressive style, takes a lot of shots. The other has a very conservative style. So the idea is that if you honor someone's learning style, learning is going to go more smoothly for them. This idea has been around at least since the 1950s. There are dozens of these different categories that people have, or categorization schemes that people have proposed. So there's visual, auditory, kinesthetic. Just to give you an example of another one, some people, there's serial versus holist.
Yeah.
So serial learners like to learn one thing at a time, and only then do you sort of give them the big picture about how it all ties together. Then holist learners prefer to learn things in the opposite way. Psychologists proposed these theories in the 90s. They quickly lost interest because when they tested to see whether or not this core prediction was true, namely the prediction that if you honor someone's
Yeah.
style, they learn more rapidly than if you don't honor their style. They found that wasn't true. And so they sort of stopped thinking about those
Wow.
theories. It's nevertheless remained incredibly popular among educators, and we could guess at why that is. But this is why I started off saying learning styles are fascinating, because the main thing that's fascinating about them is that this idea has persisted in
Mm.
the not just in the absence of evidence, but in the face of lots of evidence that there's no scientific support.
I feel like there could be a podcast series in itself on learning styles. I mean, you obviously talk about it extensively, and I find it really, really interesting. And I've noticed that so many, especially in the Australian context, so many different trends in education. So learning styles come and go. We've got all these different types of sort of waves of trends that are happening in Australia. What are some of the things that you're noticing that are happening in the US at the moment that are maybe cause for concern, and also things that you
Hmm.
think are positive?
trends in education in the US, the kinds of thing you're talking about, something that is like people are getting excited about a new development, that's sort of taken a back seat because instead, most people's energy is going into reacting to things that have happened. And in the US context, we're still reacting to COVID and still grappling with the fact that children are just not doing very well on
Yeah.
standard metrics, especially, reading and math, which are the main data points that we have. And that was especially dramatic during COVID. It really started earlier than that, about 2012, and no one's sure why. We're also dealing with phones, and the idea of phone bans have become very popular in this country. There's new legislation in most states, and the ones that don't have new legislation are considering new legislation for banning phones. And then people are thinking about AI. And that's especially true in higher education, but I think as you hear more about it in higher ed, but you hear about it in K-12 as well. There's a little bit about the positive potential about what AI might do. There's much more, I think, concern about students using AI in ways they're not supposed to.
Mm. There's so much noise down, especially in the Australian context, I think, around education, and it is so politically charged on our side of the world. I'm going to assume it's quite similar over where you are in the United States. How do we determine what is actually working? How can we actually critically assess if some of these tools are working in education? Because I've been teaching for 17 years. I absolutely love my job. I find it an incredible privilege, but there's a new thing every 5 minutes and it is
Yeah.
exhausting. So how do we know what is working and how do we begin to get back to some of those essential things?
So the knowing whether there are a couple of problems. One is that it is inherently political. When you have a system that is publicly funded, it's natural enough. I mean, I don't know how else you would arrange things that you're going to have bureaucrats who are deputized by government officials who are duly elected to make decisions about what's going to happen in classrooms. So there is a political element to this. You combine that with the fact that much of what happens in schooling entails values, often in ways that people don't recognize. And those values are tied to political points of view. So, for example, in this country, school choice remains a very vibrant topic, whether the big issue is should there be some arrangement whereby parents can select which school their child goes to, and there are lots of different flavors that comes in. But choice is a really sacred value in our more conservative political parties, and much less so in the more progressive parties. The progressive parties have more faith in government to make wise decisions for individuals. Conservatives have no such faith at all. And so when you have an issue that, like school choice, that touches on this very sensitive value that's tied up with politics, evaluation becomes much more fraught. You wanted to know the question, how do we know whether or not it works? This is all I'm doing is just setting up. Yeah, like people have very, very strong prior beliefs about whether or not something like school choice is going to end up being useful for kids, or whether kids are going to learn more
Yeah.
in a system that highlights choice. That gets coupled with the fact that these are very, very difficult empirical problems because you can't conduct true experiments, and the variables that you're interested in are tied together with all sorts of other variables that may affect the outcome.
Mhm.
So, in other words, the jurisdictions where school choice is enacted are not randomly selected. They are enacted in locales where people believe in choice, and those locales tend to have particular characteristics. And in addition, the time frame over which you expect to see some outcome is very, very lengthy, right? So, I mean, my favorite thing
Interesting.
to point out, the feedback cycle is very long. You talk about choice in particular. One of the underpinnings of the motivation behind choice is, well, if parents don't like the school, they'll leave, right? And so schools are motivated to improve. Well, that's true of a Chinese restaurant. If I go to a restaurant and I get a bad meal, it's immediately apparent to me that this is a bad meal and I won't be back. It is not anything like apparent to a parent in the same way that a school is ill-serving their child. So that's just the theoretical piece, but
Fascinating.
the you still have this problem of the very, very long window of data collection and analysis that's
Yeah.
necessary.
I'm interested, Dan. I do want to be respectful of your time, but just a couple of more questions, if you don't mind. If you could wave a magic wand and change one thing about the education system, and I know you're speaking particularly from a US context,
Hmm.
what would it be from your experience looking in as a cognitive scientist? What do you think would be
Yeah, I think,
major shift?
well, I of course have bias here. And
Sure.
I'm assuming, the magic wand is not something like every child would love school and every child
Yeah,
would learn,
that's true. Yeah.
right. So that's a
That's a,
boring magic wand.
yeah, that's right.
And I mean, my magic wand is no more realistic, but it's one more step removed from the outcomes we want. It would be that people would see a role for empiricism that would really be determinative. In other words, right now in the US context, and from what I know in the Australian context as well, data and science and an empirical approach is basically a rhetorical device. If it's on your side, great, you use it. If it's not, you use other rhetorical devices. You talk louder or you call people names or something like that. In other words,
It's
data
very
is not
similar here. Yeah.
yeah, data is not seen as
Yeah.
determinative. Like in medicine, if, you propose a new drug and there's a really good drug trial, yeah, like, you'll try and complain about the way the drug trial was done. But the reason you're doing that, you don't feel free to just completely ignore it. You feel like if there is empirical evidence this
Yeah.
drug doesn't work, then my position is in
Yeah.
trouble. That would be my magic wand, was that everybody would see education as being comparable.
Yeah. Once again, there is a whole podcast episode in itself, and we down here in our little pocket of the world in Australia, we do tend to tend trends that the UK and the US set, especially in education, we tend to follow. Some of those are concerning, some of them are inspiring. So I have a level of cautiousness with what I'm seeing at the moment, not only over in your side of the world, but also where I'm originally from in the UK. Dan, what is something that you think the US education system is doing really well when it comes to some of the things that we're talking about? What are you
Hmm.
optimistic and what are you hopeful for?
I'm hard pressed to think of anything that's going incredibly well. I would also say there's nothing I would point to that would be a comparable disaster. Like, oh my gosh, we really need to be paying. I think there are lots of things that are going okay, but there's certainly room for improvement. Yeah, off the top of my head, there probably is something that if someone pointed out to me, I'd say like, oh yeah, that's actually something that's going really well, but
Yeah.
nothing comes to mind. But it's an interesting question.
Interesting. Dan, final question, if you don't mind. There are teachers and school leaders all over the world that listen to this podcast. I receive comments every day about the value that these conversations are having with teachers. Dan, what suggestions would you give to teachers who are just about to step into the profession for the first time about ways that they could improve a student's experience in their class? What would be one takeaway? I know you're saying that you don't usually give single pieces of advice, but I'm wondering you'd make an exception for this last question.
What the truth is, and I don't think this would be especially helpful, but if it were really a teacher staring down their first day, and I'll also say, I feel like a fraud giving this advice because I feel like I'm not anyone who really, I don't have the experience that merits giving advice that circumstance, but this is safe because it's just a podcast. The truth is, what I would probably do is try and convince them not to be afraid. I think it's extraordinarily intimidating going in that first day. I've asked lots of teachers about their initial experiences. Almost universally, it's some version of can't believe they're going to leave me alone with these children. Just it's
Yeah,
very, very intimidating. So
I
I
remember
would,
that day. Yeah.
yeah. Well, what was your experience?
Gosh, it was yeah, I remember I got a phone call. I just graduated. I just went to my graduation. I got a phone call the next day saying, I want you to come in and be what we call a casual teacher, so a day-to-day teacher. And I was shown my class and then they left. And the class just looked at me and I thought, um, okay, here we go. And
That,
it was a really daunting experience. And it's something
yeah.
which I will never forget. And I've had the privilege over many years of mentoring just some incredible graduate teachers, but that feeling, that first day feeling is terrifying. And you feel I felt like an absolute fraud. I'd done all of this study at university, I'd got my master's and all of this
Yeah.
stuff, but nothing could quite prepare me for the complexity of working with 24 miniature human beings under 5 years old. It was incredibly difficult, but also just wonderful. And I know teaching is not everybody's profession, and my wife is from a family of teachers and didn't pursue that career, but I do feel sorry for people that don't get to experience that magic and that awe and that wonder of a classroom. I had a moment today where we were building sustainable farms in science, and the students were looking at farms of the future and ways that they could do farming in a way that was kinder to the planet. And the bell rang for lunch, and the students were annoyed that it was lunchtime. And I thought, this is incredible. Like they let
Yeah.
out oh, do we have to go to lunch? And it's those kind of moments I think that they're not few and far between. They happen all the time. And it's going back to what you're saying before about being sort of consciously aware of these things. I mean, it is so easy to miss these incredible opportunities every day. They happen all the time. And I think my role as a teacher is to slow down and to really notice those things because at the end of the day, my job is not about content. It's not about filling up kids with ideas and information. It's about human connection. And it's about creating a space where young people feel that they can thrive. But the educational content, I think, is secondary to that. But yeah. Dan, I've really enjoyed our conversation this evening for me, this morning for you. Your work has been truly transformative and it's so important. And just to get to unpack just a small amount of it over our short conversation has been an immense privilege. So thank you so much for giving me some of your time this morning. I can't wait to see where the rest of your career goes.
Thanks so much, Matt. I really appreciate the invitation.
Thank you.